So this talk grew out of research that I did as an MA student at York when I took a course on film festivals that was taught by Janine Marchessault. For some reason, I can't pronounce her name right now. I guess I'm slightly nervous. But anyway, the idea was that, Janine's idea that was at the end of the semester, she would take all the papers that were written and she would put them on a website, and anybody who wanted to see them could, but probably no one would. And then after she graded all the papers, she sent out an email saying, you know what, I'm going to change my mind. Basically am I still audible? My computer is doing something funny with the sound. So I hopefully, okay, still audible, great. So what happened was, at the end of the semester, after she graded all the papers, she said some of the papers were so good that they should be submitted to peer review journals and be published. But she didn't say whose papers should be published, at least not publicly, or not to me anyway. Maybe she sent out some email saying like, your paper's good, but she didn't say anything to me. And I was in this kind of ambiguous position of not knowing whether my paper was any good or not. And so rather than just ask her, I decided, well, why don't I send it off to a peer review journal and see if it is publishable? And there was, in my mind, there was like this urgency that I had to publish, because I had published like soon, because I did all my research in the fall of 2017 at the Real Asian Film Festival. And I felt like if I didn't get this out, like within a year, all the information would be out of date and it would just be this unpublishable, anachronistic essay that nobody was interested in. So the weird thing is that I submitted it to Asian Cinema, and then I didn't actually get a response until like January 2019. So already kind of beyond the what I considered the sell date for this paper, and they accepted it. And then I go through the long process of revising and checking proofs, and then it only was published in the middle of last year. And I was like, oh, thank God that's over. I never have to think about this again. And then a few weeks ago, I got this, very nice email from Dr. Shanmuganathan saying, hey, why don't you give this talk? And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, let's do that. But I think there should be kind of, an asterisk next to a lot of what I'm saying, that, it just might be out of date. And there's at least one point where I know that it is a little bit out of date. But I'll get into that later. Okay, that took probably too long. So the introduction. So Real Asian, it was founded in 1997. It's held every year in Toronto, and according to the festival's website, it's the largest Pan-Asian film festival in Canada. There are others, but this is kind of the big one in Canada, at least in Canada. And then there are others in the United States and San Francisco, New York, and other places. And the program selections, because it's mostly films from East Asia, it kind of implies this hierarchy of Asian societies and diasporas. And in addition to its programming selections, not only its program selections, but also the kind of printed materials that the festival distributes, like program guides and other things, it tends to locate an authentic, Oriental essence in the persistence of pre-industrial cultural practices that are supposedly unchanging and therefore really have no future. And so thinking about the festival as a kind of discourse, it kind of propounds this idea of Asianness, but the spectators of the festival aren't passive. They aren't just kind of, passively accepting this subject position that's kind of meted out by an all-powerful discourse. Actually, they're actively performing divergent roles in the space of the festival and online. And so racialized Asian spectators basically serve to legitimize the festival as a kind of community event. It's saying, like, here are Asian people who enjoy these films. But also at the same time, the festival needs to appeal to white spectators who are really there to kind of validate the film's, artistic merit, that they're not just films for a kind of niche Asian audience. So it's this kind of contradictory festival in a lot of ways. So thinking about the festival's programming selections, the festival started out, as I said, in the late 1990s. And the first year it was just North American films by directors of Chinese, Filipino, Japanese, and Korean heritage. So on the slide here, you can see an image from a film called Shopping with Fangs. That was the first film directed by Justin Lin, who went on to direct Better Luck Tomorrow, which is a kind of classic Asian American film, and then also one of the Fast and the Furious sequels, Tokyo Drift. So he eventually became a much more commercial filmmaker after starting out as a kind of indie filmmaker. And what happened with Real Asian is that there was this kind of gradual kind of mission creep where they started out as just, North American films by Chinese, Filipino, Japanese, and Korean ethnic filmmakers. And then they kind of expanded outwards. And so the second year they had films from Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong, Japan, and South Korea, not Taiwan. Taiwan would be later. And then also expanding out over the next couple of years into Southeast Asia increasingly. And they had like spotlight programs, different years for particular national cinemas. Like one year it was Malaysian cinema, another year it was Thai cinema. But it wasn't really until 2013 that they actually started screening films from South Asia, which is kind of an interesting omission, especially when you consider that India is one of the largest film producing countries in the world, or produces one of the countries that produces the most number of films, I should say. And from 2015, they've screened a handful of films from Afghan Canadian filmmakers, which seems to indicate that as far as the festival is concerned, the kind of outermost frontier of Oriental culture is Afghanistan, and Central Asia and the Middle East don't really count as Asian cinema. But despite this kind of opening up of the festival to other national cinemas, other diasporic communities, the overwhelming emphasis remains on East Asian cinema and diasporic East Asian filmmakers, rather than being a kind of equitable distribution of Asian cinema. And so the year that I attended the festival, there were about 17 feature films. This doesn't include short films, but there were 17 features. 6 of these were Chinese, and it's a very diplomatic breakdown. 2 from mainland China, 2 from Hong Kong, and 2 from Taiwan. The politics of screening Chinese films or Chinese cinemas at Asian film festivals might be an interesting topic for research in another paper. I didn't really get into that in this paper, but maybe one day I'll turn to that. Then 4 from Japan. So we're already talking more than half of the films, the feature films that were screened at the festival in 2017 were from either China or Japan, including the opening night film, which was a Japanese film, Dear Étranger by Mishima Yukiko is the director, which you can see on the slide there. There were 2 from India, but I'm kind of putting an asterisk next to one of the Indian films because it was directed by a German guy. There were 2 films from the Philippines, 1 from Thailand, and then there were 3 Canadian films, and that breaks down to 1 by a Filipino-Canadian filmmaker, 1 by an ethnic Korean filmmaker, 1 by a Vietnamese-Canadian, and then 1 film from the US by an ethnic Korean filmmaker. So overwhelmingly, the emphasis is on East Asia, and then kind of secondarily Southeast Asia, and then there's just like a little bit first East Asia, second Southeast Asia, and then kind of just a little bit of South Asia. I'm putting kind of an asterisk next to this claim because the 2020 festival, during COVID, it was a smaller festival. They screened fewer films, but the films had a more kind of equitable distribution, and actually expanded a little bit in terms of one of the films was a Japanese Kazakh co-production, which is the first time that I believe that a film from Kazakhstan was shown at Real Asian. And the first film, I think, from any Central Asian country. Of course, Central Asia doesn't produce that many films. And the 2021 lineup hasn't been announced yet. So whether this is like, a real change in the orientation of the festival, or whether it was just this one year because of COVID and they couldn't, there weren't so many films being made and they couldn't show so many films. I don't know yet. It's kind of, it's something that remains to be seen. And so in a 2007 conversation with Anita Lee, who's one of the co-founders of Real Asian, Cameron Bailey basically kind of asked her just straight up, like, so why did the festival define the Asian in Real Asian as East Asian and not a kind of broader definition? And her response was, another thing that I learned from the culture wars of the 1990s was how difficult it was to find common ground between Asian communities. So I wanted to define as small and specific a cultural space as possible. The key people of Real Asian were all East Asian descent, so we decided we should do what we knew best. One year programmer actually wanted to list all the countries that were included in our definition, and it became impossible to draw the line. So it's kind of an interesting quote here, because on the one hand, she's saying, yeah, we just wanted to kind of have this kind of small, focused festival. We were East Asian people. We thought we should, stick to that. But they still took the name Real Asian. They took this very big name for a festival that's actually, in its original conception was kind of quite geographically focused. And unfortunately, in this conversation with Camera Vale, it's never kind of picked up, well, why didn't you just call the festival Real East Asian or Real, East and Southeast Asian? Why Real Asian? Why this, huge swath of land that you're trying to kind of lay claim to representing? And, and if you go on the festival's website, there's actually no explicit definition of Asian cinema or culture. So not on the website, not on the program guide, not in any of the kind of texts that the festival puts out is there any kind of firm definition of this is what Asia is, and this is what Asian cinema and culture is. So it's kind of left deliberately, maybe not deliberately vague, but it's in the festival's interest in a way to be vague, because all film festivals have this institutional pressure to expand indefinitely, to show more films at more venues over a greater number of days, because like most festivals in Canada, Real Asian depends on corporate sponsorship for its survival, and what the festival delivers to its corporate sponsors is eyeballs. It's part of the attention economy. That if you can deliver eyeballs, you have a valuable festival as far as corporate sponsors are concerned. And of course, in Canada, we're talking about the East Asian community in Toronto. There's a lot of money, so this is a valuable demographic to target. And if you go on their website, there's a section about advertising rates, and they kind of give a breakdown of how the audience self-identifies, mostly as Chinese, and so that information is very valuable to corporate sponsors who are thinking about spending money on this festival to kind of get the attention of the people who are going to the festival. And the thing about Real Asian is it's quite a long festival. So in the original Real Asian was like quite short. It was 2 days. In 2017, when I attended the festival, it was 10 days, which is it's not the longest festival in Toronto. I think TIFF is like a week and a half, and that's like one of the biggest film festivals in the world, obviously. Real Asian is 10 days, which is quite long. A comparable festival would be Imaginative, which screens films by Indigenous filmmakers, and that only lasts, I think, 6 days. So it's a relatively, it's still quite, that's like a kind of like a median, between like a very short 2-day festival and TIFF. 6 is kind of somewhere in the middle. Real Asian kind of tends towards being one of the longer festivals, and so that's part of its appeal to its corporate sponsors, is that it can deliver more eyeballs. And it's funny that as early as 1999, the festival's program guide was already boasting that Real Asia has become a high-profile event that has grown from its humble roots way back in 1997. That is, 2 years ago. So almost like immediately after the festival starts, there's this kind of push to grow the festival, to make it more attractive to corporate sponsors. And even if it hasn't grown, we're just going to say that it's grown, because I think at this point it was still only a 4-day festival, which is kind of on the shorter side. But they're already kind of pushing this narrative of like, we're a big festival now, like we're ready to sit at the grown-up table. And part of this, and so as I mentioned earlier, there wasn't really the festival didn't show any South Asian films until 2013, and there are probably a lot of different reasons for this. And one of them is that there are already 2 film festivals in Toronto that screen South Asian films. One of them is TIFF, because it has a global scope, and the other is IFSA Toronto, the International Film Festival of South Asia, which is just exclusively South Asian films. And so the festivals are kind of competing for South Asian films. And so Real Asian didn't really get into that scramble until 2013, once it had kind of achieved a certain mass that would make it attractive also to, South Asian filmmakers to have their work shown at Real Asian rather than at IFSA Toronto, assuming that the film wasn't, good enough or prestigious enough to get into TIFF, which is still the major festival in Toronto. And the reason the festival needs to show at least, some South Asian films is basically in order to kind of keep the name Real Asian, because it became like too strange that, you had the largest Pan-Asian festival in Canada, but there's this huge section of Asia that just wasn't being represented at all. So they need to show at least some Asian film or South Asian films to kind of, maintain the name Real Asian without people kind of going like, but that's not really their focus. And again, I mentioned earlier that the breakdown of the audience that they give on their website, it's mostly people from of East Asian heritage. So the audience is predominantly East Asian, the films are predominantly East Asian, and there's just this kind of like tokenistic inclusion of South Asian cinema, but there's not really, if you go to the screens, you don't actually see that many South Asian people. So it's not really a festival that has strong ties to the South Asian community in the way that it has ties with the East Asian community, which is really its main focus. And so the kind of the implication of this in terms of the festival's discourses is that the festival basically posits the Orient as a series of concentric circles where you have East Asians in the center as like the most Asian Asians. And then at one remove, you have Southeast Asians. And then kind of at the outer periphery, you have South Asia, including Afghanistan, and then Central Asia and the Middle East. It's kind of like vast permanent darkness. That's really neither Asia nor Europe. And so that's kind of how the festival's discourse kind of, give this image of what is Asia and what is Asianness. And since the project of the festival as a identity-based festival is to basically make a particular community, in this case, the Asian community, make it visible to itself and to the general public, at least for the period that the festival exists, it really requires a set of images and ideas representing Orientalness. And so there's a certain amount of self-orientalization involved in the festival. And in particular, it posits basically a kind of binary opposition of unchanging Oriental traditions and the encroachments of Western modernity. So the idea is that, you have these kind of pre-industrial Chinese, or not just Chinese, but East Asian and kind of Southeast Asian and just, Oriental traditions that are kind of fixed, and they're unchanging, and they've kind of been the same, since time immemorial. And they are kind of constantly under threat from the kind of encroachments of Western modernity, which have this kind of homogenizing effect on Asian societies. And this is evident in a lot of the films that are presented, but also in the festival's own discourses. So, program guides, press releases, and other documents put out by the festival. I give a couple examples in the article that I wrote on this subject. But I'll just give one here, which is the cover of the 2008 program guide. And so what you basically see here is a kimono-clad sumo wrestler standing on a subway train surrounded by fashionable young people. And of course, the thing there are a couple ways you could read this image, but of course, the main thing that kind of stands out right away is this absolute juxtaposition of, quote unquote, traditional Asian culture, in this case, specifically Japanese, and the kind of signifiers of modernity, so mass transit and consumer culture. And, and you can read this image this juxtaposition in a lot of different ways, but within the kind of overall context of the festival as a discourse, its meaning is kind of predetermined as showing, this kind of erasure of of Asian distinctiveness that is kind of gradually happening as a result of modernity, basically, which is seen as this kind of imported thing, because the traditional Asian cultural practices, they're kind of located specifically in the past. And so this guy, not only does he kind of stand out immediately because he's wearing, clothes that are not contemporary, but also, he's in a way, he's kind of surrounded. So even though he's a sumo wrestler, he kind of looks a little bit nervous, like almost like he's under threat, like these young shoppers are like kind of surrounding him like a gang almost. And of course, and the thing is, the other thing to point out is that you wouldn't know that this is Japan if it wasn't for the sumo wrestler. If you just kind of mentally, edit him out of the picture, this could be Shanghai, this could be Hong Kong, this could be Seoul, it could be any East, it could be even Manila, it could be any East or Southeast Asian city. It could even be, it could actually be New York, it could be Toronto, because, we have Asian people here too. So, so if the festival needs to represent Asianness, they need some, images that really immediately, when you look at them, like say like, that's Asia. And so there's this kind of anxiety in the festival, both in its printed materials and in a lot of the films that are shown at the festival, about the distinctiveness of Asian societies being kind of erased by this kind of increasing embrace of Western modernity. So one of the films screened in 2017 was a short documentary called Nests of Gold, which is about bird's nest soup, which is a delicacy in Hong Kong that is, increasingly not popular with young people. And in the documentary, there are all these interview subjects who are kind of bemoaning that, young people aren't interested in this traditional, quintessentially Hong Kong delicacy, and that the city is kind of losing its identity to encroaching Western modernity, which is just kind of, flattening things out. And so there's, in a way, a kind of denial of coevalness, to use Johannes Fabian's terms, that basically, Asian culture exists in the past. And to the extent that one is Asian, or one is, authentically Asian, one is not really modern. And so the young people surrounding the sumo wrestler, they're not really, they're not true Asians, because they're embracing the West. So that's kind of how the discourse of the festival kind of situates this image, or kind of fixes its meaning. And of course, the other thing to remember is that, really, it's not just a discourse, it's not just, a screening of films, it's also a kind of it's to make the community visible. And so the slogan for the festival in 2017, which was written in like big capital letters on the program guide, and they had and before the film started, there was like a slide on the screen that said, had the same message: represent on and off the screen. So the idea is that we're not just looking at films about Asian people, but, Asian people are going to the films and to the events to represent themselves as a community. And it's obviously very important for the festival to attract racially marked Asian spectators, because it would be kind of weird if it was an Asian film festival and then not many Asian people showed up. So they need to kind of, try to engage a kind of imagined Asian community in Toronto by kind of, showing films that would appeal to them. And so what happened is, the festival in 1997, their explicit commitment in the program guide was to auteur works, independently produced and speaking an original and stimulating voice. But just as the director Justin Lin kind of decided to, go Hollywood after, making a couple indie films, also Real Asian, there was this kind of drift away from that original commitment to independent cinema towards more commercially oriented films. But at the same time, in terms of their subject matter, we're still, still culturally specific enough that they seem kind of distinct from, non-Asian or from, let's say like, European and American films about white people. So you have this so in the films, you have this very kind of culturally specific subject matter, but the form of the films tends not to be, overly demanding. It's quite, in terms of the films it shows, the festival tends to be relatively mainstream. So this isn't a festival where you're going to see the new film by Lav Diaz, because his films are just, beyond the pale of most film goers. And so the only people, so a couple of years ago, TIFF had a screening of Evolution of a Filipino Family, which is 11 and a half hours long. And I was probably the most Asian person. No, I think I remember seeing one or two other, Asian people, but it was mostly white people who turned up for it, like hardcore cinephiles, guys with beards and ponytails, that kind of set of people. So to get the Asian community more broadly, not just the handful of Asian hardcore cinephiles, they have to kind of they don't make too much demands on the spectators' cognitive abilities. They're quite accessible films generally. So I'll show you a clip from one film that was screened at Real Asian in 2017, which is actually a really delightful film called Teiichi Battle of Supreme High. Unfortunately, the only clip I could find online was a Spanish trailer. So basically, if you don't speak Japanese or Spanish, it's a high school comedy. It's basically satirizing Japanese politics by setting the story in an elite high school in Tokyo in the 1970s, and it's about these basically amoral dandies who are absolutely ruthless in their campaign for student council president, because they see it as their ticket towards not only becoming the prime minister, but then later like ruling his own empire. And so it's based on a manga. It's a very kind of accessible commercial film, and just even if you don't speak Spanish or Japanese, just watching the trailer, you should get a sense at least of the film's tone and its style, which is quite comic and delightful. And so it's not really a film that if you show it to most audiences, they're going to be like, huh? It's like a very it's like a crowd pleasing kind of film. So I'll just first I have to share my audio so you can hear the Japanese dialogue. It's only being select share, something share computer audio. Okay. So if nothing else, at least you get a sense of how pretty the boys are in this movie. So it's a film with quite a lot of commercial appeal, you might say. But at the same time, of course, the festival can't go too far in the other direction and just be like showing purely commercial movies. It has to kind of maintain a certain amount of artistic street cred in order to remain viable as a film festival. And so the festival does kind of keep one foot in the art house in terms of showing movies that are maybe not as accessible as Teiichi Battle of Supreme High. And this was reflected also in the awards that the festival gave out, which of course exist to generate cultural capital. As is the case with any film festival, you take films that are often not very commercial, they play at a festival, and just being an official selection of a certain film festival kind of boosts the profile of a film. And then of course there are the awards, and then the idea is that the films take that kind of cultural capital that they acquire at film festivals, and then it kind of feeds back into a kind of commercial appeal for when the films go into general release. And so the film that won the award for Best Feature Film in 2017 was a Filipino film called Women of the Weeping River, which is not like, as I mentioned Lob Diaz earlier, this is not as demanding as a Lob Diaz film, but it's still very much, a film in a kind of established festival film style with, long takes, kind of contemplative narrative. Not much happens in the film. And of course, if you look at the credits, the film was supported by institutions associated with different film festivals. So the Sundance Institute, the Asian Cinema Fund, which is associated with the Busan International Film Festival, and the Hubert Balls Fund, which is associated with Rotterdam. So this is a film that was basically like a bunch of film festivals got together in a lab and they produced a film that would be appropriate for film festivals. So it's almost like a kind of textbook example of, if you wanted to know what festivals, what quote unquote festival cinema was, you would wind up with this movie, because it's just been genetically engineered to play at festivals and pick up awards. Even though it's not really a great example of the genre, it's not a very inspired example of it. And it's basically a film with quite a static narrative. So it's about these two families in rural Mindanao, and long before even the film starts, these families have had this kind of ongoing blood feud. And at the end of the film, there's no sense that this feud is going to be resolved at any time in the future. So actually, there's no real arc to the narrative. It's just, most of the characters are alive at the beginning, and then at the end, most of them are dead. But they're still going to keep, the ones who are surviving are just going to keep fighting with each other. And so basically, there are not a lot of signifiers to tell you when the film is actually set. So the characters almost seem to exist kind of out of time in a way. So the two families, one is Muslim, one is Catholic. The Muslim family seems to live in the backwoods. They don't have access to electricity or running water. The Catholic family is somewhat more modern because the family matriarch enjoys listening to like scratchy jazz records, but none of them are like, neither of them is completely contemporary. And it's only towards the end of the film that we actually find out that the film is set basically in the present, or in the 20-teens. And so there's this kind of, again, going back to Johannes Fabian, this kind of denial of coevalness. There's this idea that, that the lives of these characters in rural Mindanao they're kind of perpetuating a static Oriental culture that just, has been the same since time immemorial and is incapable of change or growth. And so to the extent that it does change or could change in the future, then it would cease to be Oriental, because it would just be an example of the further encroachment of Western modernity. And so basically here, to locate an Oriental essence, the film has to kind of go out into the backwoods and find our contemporary ancestors, basically. And so I'll show you a clip from the film. And this is a scene from almost towards the end of the film. And this is, like, I think, the first real indication that the story is set in the 20-teens, because the patriarch of the Muslim family is negotiating with an Islamic State commander to buy an automatic rifle. And so that actually situates the film in a very contemporary context, if you call the armed struggle in Mindanao, where the separatists were fighting against the government. And so this is like the first allusion to something really contemporary in the film, but in a way it just kind of reinforces the kind of, or sort of, it makes the case that implicitly that the problems in Mindanao with the armed separatists could be understood as the perpetuation of these static Oriental cultures that are just perpetuating an older form of existence that is incompatible with modernity. So I will share my sound again. I will watch the clip. Okay, so as you can see in this clip, there's an emphasis on bartering and kind of associating the characters with a kind of older mode of exchange that predates modernity, and also the fact that they're kind of swearing an allegiance to the Islamic State, not based on religious extremism, but just kind of based on that this is like the local culture. So there's a kind of real emphasis on the film on kind of the backwardness or the lack of modernity in this area of Mindanao. Oops, starting again. So as I said, the festival is basically a space. So it's not just for films, it's for the audiences to basically perform their identities for a public audience. And the festival provides a number of venues for this. One is like Q&A sessions after the film. Another is panel discussions where they bring in people in the industry to talk about particular issues. I attended a panel in 2017 on the subject of cultural appropriation, where they had different Canadian screenwriters kind of come in and talk about their experiences writing for Canadian television, and then of course on social media, so Facebook and Twitter and things like that. These are all spaces where different audience members can perform their identities for the public. And so what I noticed was that very often racially marked Asian spectators tended to emphasize their unique ability to empathize with the stories being represented on the screen. So during at the opening night screening of Dear Étranger, after the film was over, when one of the first questions from the audience was a young man saying that the lead character reminded him of his father because he was so kind of emotionally repressed, and asked the director Mishima Yukiko, whether she, based the character at all on her father. And so there was this attempt to kind of, try to establish a kind of bond as, between the audience member and the director as, Asian subjects who had this kind of common experience of an emotionally repressed father. And if you didn't have that, then you really didn't have, an Asian upbringing. So, if your father gave you a hug, then, you're not Asian, basically. But of course, as I said, it's a community event, but it's not just Asians who are, ethnic Asians or racially marked Asian spectators who are turning up for the screenings. Also, a lot of white people like to go to these screenings. And what I found with Asian spectators was that there was this attempt to kind of imaginatively project themselves into an Oriental culture through an act of sympathetic understanding. So they were, which often shaded into a kind of liberal masochism. So one of the films that I saw in 2017 was a documentary called A Whale of a Tale. It's about the whaling industry in the Japanese city of Taiji. The director is a Japanese woman who has lived in New York for many years. And basically the film was conceived as a response to another documentary called The Cove that was very critical of the whaling industry. And this was an attempt, this film was basically an attempt to explain, the position of the Japanese fishermen to a non-Japanese audience that doesn't have this kind of cultural background. And one of the things that is a kind of motif in the film is the kind of obnoxious behavior of Western animal rights activists who don't understand Japanese culture. And so in the Q&A, a lot of the Q&A was not really questions, but just, white people trying to convince the director that they were not one of those white people, that they were one of the good ones. And so there was this guy who went on this really melodramatic rant about how obnoxious these animal rights activists were and how hypocritical it was of Westerners to criticize anything Japan does after hunting the American buffalo to extinction and the decimation of indigenous cultures. And it was really quite a spectacle to see because it had, there was, it's a Q&A, but there was no question there. It was just he was just so desperate, like, I'm not a bad white person. It was basically the kind of the subtext of that, after watching this film, I understand, the position of the Japanese fishermen, because I've been able through this documentary to kind of project myself into their point of view. So so if you go to the festival, you're gonna hear some interesting comments from white people. And one of the things that's noteworthy about the festival compared to, even a very large festival like TIFF, they have screenings at different venues, but all of those venues are walkable from one another. This is not the case with Real Asian. So Real Asian, they have some screenings that are downtown in these kind of very prestigious settings, including the TIFF Bell Lightbox, but also, the Isabel Bader Center of Performing Arts, Innis Town Hall at the University of Toronto. And then they have other screenings way, way out in the suburbs in venues like the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center, which is way up in North York and is not really accessible by public transit. And there's almost kind of this stark divide between films that are kind of aimed at a primarily Asian diasporic audience. For example, Teichi Battle of Supreme High, which was shown at the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center, and then films like Women of the Weeping River, which was shown at the TIFF Bell Lightbox, and these kind of more. So it was kind of this split. It was almost like two festivals basically that had very little communication between them. Because if you just went to if you went to the downtown, if you just went to the downtown screenings, you had a completely different experience than if you had gone to the screenings in the suburbs. And so I think that was, there was a certain kind of conscious intent there in terms of figuring out which films would play well to each audience. And so the films that were screened in the suburbs tend to be much more commercial, tend to be much more accessible. The films screened downtown tended to be art films like Women in the Weeping River, or they tend to be documentaries like A Whale of a Tale. And so basically, you had kind of one festival for, quote unquote insiders, to name to cite the name of the festival, Real Asians. And then you had another festival basically for the general public downtown that was, basically for, outsiders who wanted to project themselves into into an alien culture. And so so in a way, even though you had these different groups performing their performing their identities for the public, they didn't really need each other as an audience. They just need, so if you had, a predominantly ethnic Asian audience, they were just kind of performing for themselves, Asianness, and then the white audience that was, trying to imagine themselves, project themselves into this alien culture. They were basically projected. They were, of course, in the example of the man who gave the interesting comment at the Q&A, he was basically performing, so they brought out the Japanese filmmakers so that, the man could unload his liberal guilt on her. It was kind of an interesting, but so basically he was kind of performing it for the director, but also for the other white people that, he wanted to kind of, in a way that, like, I guess we would call it virtue signaling today. I don't know if that term had kind of taken root in 2017. I guess it did, but yeah. So that's basically what was going on, was that, Asian spectators could kind of, talk about, how Asian they were because their fathers were emotionally repressed, and white spectators could talk about, could kind of say that, yeah, I'm not a bad white person. I understand Asian culture. So just to kind of quickly wrap up, so the continued existence of Real Asian really kind of depends on maintaining the stark division of Occident and Orient, because if there wasn't a division between Occident and Orient, then you wouldn't really have an Asian festival, right? You need something, Asia needs to be kind of kept distinct from the West in order for the festival to have any real justification. And in that sense, you can situate the festival within this broader discourse of multiculturalism, which, as Ong Yen points out, basically serves to keep Western culture white by preventing non-white, non-European elements from fully entering and therefore contaminating the center of white Western culture. And in that sense, the festival actually perpetuates the marginalization of Canadians of Asian heritage, because the implication of the festival's discourses is that, to the extent that one is Asian, one is proportionately not Canadian and not Western. And of course, you see this in the festival, in the participant behavior that the festival solicits. That the festival basically calls on racially marked Asian spectators and also white spectators to kind of perform their identity in a public space or online. And so that even at the festival, even at the screenings where they were kind of side by side, or there was a kind of a mix of racially marked Asian spectators and white spectators, the discourse of the festival and the way that people perform their identities actually seem to kind of move Occident and Orient. The boundary kind of separate seem to get stronger rather than dissolving.